Hello, friends. We're going to be taking another step forward in this course, Intro to Christian History. We have just kind of wrapped up our time in the early church period, particularly the church before power, the early church, what we're calling, and we're transitioning to what we are referring to as the imperial church or the church in power. And the choice of using power as sort of this framework to think about periods in church history then affects some of the things we want to talk about. And so as we transition this session, we'll be looking at particularly what we call political theologies, or the historical approach, particularly at this time, to faith and politics in Christianity in the early church period. Now, when we say politics, probably a lot of words come to mind, a lot of ideas about, political parties, and in Lebanon, particularly the Zeb, all these sort of political parties that are tied to militias, kind of an ugly arena of fighting and lying and manipulation and all kinds of things. And outside Lebanon too, this would also be characteristic. We see in the US election cycle all kinds of messiness in politics. So what does faith have to do with politics? And what's the role of the church, of Christianity, in the political realm? So these are some of the questions we might look at when we consider what we'll be looking at today. This is helpful for us to just understand some dynamics in the church's response to these, and how this shapes, ultimately, how it shapes beliefs and practices in the church. So all of these are what we will be looking at in this session on early Christian political theologies. So oftentimes when we look at political theology, in the present, certainly, there's sort of this assumption that what is best is this dividing wall between church and state. And oftentimes in Protestant theology, I should say, we talk about the importance of this division. And this is certainly shaped by the United States context, and some of the thinking that has come to be in sort of the contemporary period. This hasn't always been the case. This dividing wall that you see in this sort of cartoon between church on the one hand, or church and state, that wants to keep the state on one side of the wall, the church on the other, has never been such a clean division, neither in the present nor obviously in the past, which is what we'll be looking at today. So this is just a cheeky, funny sort of little cartoon that sort of captures church people telling the state to stay on their side of the wall, but then breaking down that wall and interfering with matters of the state. You better stay on your side of the wall. We'll be looking at this today. Now, two really important things as we're beginning to talk about and think about theology, or a political theology, are the two words that make this up: theology and political. And what do we mean? What is meant when we're talking about theology and politics? When we talk about theology and politics, it's helpful to sort of have these definitions in mind. Theology, when we talk about theology, what we mean, or what I mean when I'm referring to that, is simply speaking about God and God's activity in the world. So it's talk about God and God's activity in the world. We can study this academically as we do in this class, but it's talk about God and God's activity in the world. And then when we talk about political is a word that we're going to understand or use in this kind of way, that it has to do with deliberations about, or talk about, if you will, ideas and beliefs about what is the good life or flourishing as a group, and how to pursue that, the good life and flourishing as a group. So this idea of political has more to do, or this way of understanding political has more to do with general society, with how we organize society, how we organize the good life, and what it means as a society to flourish. So this is what we mean by political, not the specific meaning of the political parties that sort of argue and bicker and wrestle and oppose each other in order to hold power to decide about uh, the good life or holding power. So our focus is a broader sense of political. Quite interesting. Little side note: in Greece, in Cyprus, in the present day, the civil defense, the services that sort of provide fire extinguishing, that provide civil support, are called politike amina. The political is as a related word right at the beginning of what essentially are civil services, service to society, that provide for and protect life, good life. So this is the sense of political when we're using that word in this particular discussion, in this session, how we want to understand that. So the questions that we talk about when we're talking about political theologies are questions about the following. What should be the role of religious beliefs, theological convictions in the domain of public life? Questions we might ask when we're doing work in the area of political theologies are: how should people of faith engage in this social and political life? Should we stand outside of it and separate ourselves from it completely? How should church be organized and ruled? Interestingly, we often forget, perhaps, that politics also influences or shapes church life. And then when we remember that and think about our experiences in church, we recognize how political oftentimes church leadership can be. So it's incredibly valuable and significant to actually take time to think about politics of church life and how we organize and lead in churches. Another question related to this is: how should God's rule, how people understand and have this idea of God's rule, how should that be put into practice in society? Should God's rule be something that a small group of people in a church leadership decide and then try to apply through political life, through parliament, through the civil processes of society? Should God's rule and our understanding of God's rule in the world shape how we vote? Another question would be: what role do earthly rulers and kingdoms have in God's creation? Are they ordained by God? Are they chosen by God, even if they don't believe in God? How do we make sense of earthly rulers in God's creation in this world? What is the good life? Here's another question: how do we actually define what good political life or society is? And then, what is the ultimate goal of political life for people of faith? If we are to be involved in political life, in the life of society, as people of faith, what should be our ultimate goal with that? So when we're talking about political theologies or political theology as a field, these are some of the questions that come up. And to be honest, political theology, or the study of political theology, is something that has really developed in the contemporary period. This is a newer discipline or field of study. But we can take these questions in the field of political theology and then start to look back historically. And as we think historically and study historical periods, we can get a sense of previous approaches or earlier approaches to these questions. So the questions of how people of faith should engage in social and political life. And I hope for those of you who have been in this class following the course of Intro to Christian History, we've had our ears attuned to some of these questions in the early church period. But today we're going to take a full, in this session, we'll look very closely, kind of our full gaze will be upon these questions, and particularly the transition of the church from a period of being outside of power to being in power. And so we'll look at that and these questions in relation to this. So we come to this early church period. We recognize sort of these two distinct periods. Later on in this course, we'll look at the results of, or the other versions or other forms of political theology that would come about in other periods. Today we'll just be focusing on sort of the pre-Constantine and then post-Milan periods. So faith and politics in early Christianity before the Edict of Milan. In this period, it's important for us to recognize that early Christian political theologies or political thinking is diverse, and you'll remember this from our time in reading and studying the apologists. These sort of early defenses of and explanations of Christian faith are what might be called, or what we could consider, forms of political thinking. They're formed and developed in a variety of social and political settings. But what's helpful for us is to recognize that none of these apologists were writing systematically. They're active, or they're reactive, I should say. They're contingent, they're incidental sorts of responses to other issues that are coming up. And the key questions that they're answering are not so much about politics directly, but having to do with, questions like, should Christians be involved in the army? Should Christians participate in the military? Can Christians be soldiers? What's Christians' relationship to broader society? And particularly when we think of sort of classic education, training in classical culture. Should Christians read and be aware of and respond to pagan literary classics, for example? Should Christians participate in and be formed by the classic educational system? And Christians, as you remember, as I hope you remember, had different kinds of ideas about that. When we come to the apologists, you'll remember there were a couple of different kinds of ideas. The context of early Christianity, the background for our kind of thinking about this, are some of these accusations. We find them, a classic example is in Pliny's letter to Marcus Aurelius, the Roman leader at the time, that Christians were being accused of, or Christians were accused of being atheists for refusing imperial worship. They're praying to the gods, or refusing to pray to the gods of Rome, refusing to burn incense before the image of the emperor, renouncing Jesus. They refused to renounce Jesus as Lord. And so there was a question in Roman culture and Roman society in many different cities about, to whom are these Christians loyal? And this is particularly the content of Pliny's letter, is wrestling with, what should I do with these Christians? And we've looked at some extracts of different letters from the apologists and how they responded to these kinds of accusations. Tertullian is one example that we can kind of briefly look at. We'll look at sort of three major approaches just to remind ourselves of these, and then move to this sort of massive change that happens with the Edict of Milan, which we'll come to. So in Tertullian, we have one of these approaches that is represented. Tertullian writes in Against Heresies, or Against the Heretics, that this approach, he writes, the same subject matter is discussed over and over again by the heretics and philosophers. The same arguments are involved. From where does evil come from? Why is it permitted? What's the origin of man? From where do these ideas come from? From all of these, when the Apostle Paul would restrain us, he expressly names philosophy as that which would have us be on our guard, which he would have us be on our guard against. The famous quote, "What indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What concord is there between the academy and the church? What agreement is there between heretics and Christians? Our instructions come from the Porch of Solomon, away with sort of all of these other philosophies, away with attempts to see any kind of compatibility between Christianity and Greek philosophy that has influenced Roman society." So Tertullian's stance in all of this, in these questions, is to reject this sort of compatibility, reject the authority of classic culture, classic Roman culture, and its empire over Scripture and Christianity. So this would be one approach that we see to political theology, what we might call today political theology, in the early church period. Tertullian represents an approach that wants to reject the authority of Roman culture, of this classical culture, and his intention would be to hold Scripture and only kind of turn to Scripture, but to otherwise reject. That, importantly, though, in this quote, you see that that Tertullian is not intending to entirely reject Roman culture, to be completely, entirely separate from it. He writes in this same letter, Christians are no different from the rest in their nationality, language, or customs. They live in their own countries, but here's the key, as sojourners, as foreigners, as visitors, travelers, or pilgrims. And yet, they fulfill their duties as citizens, but they suffer as foreigners. They find their homeland wherever they are, but their homeland is not in any one place. They are in flesh, but do not live according to the flesh. They live on earth, but are citizens of heaven. Often I find when I think about those who are displaced, people who have experienced displacement because of war, or because of, well, for a variety of reasons, who find themselves outside of home, who find themselves displaced from home or displaced from belonging in a particular place, that they have unique insights. They have, because of their experience in displacement, something of important insight, I think, that Tertullian is talking about, this sense of being foreign to a place, of not belonging to a place, and yet trying to contribute and trying to belong, trying to be good citizens in this place, to obey all the laws, but live at a higher level and recognize their duty, their belonging is to somewhere else, to somewhere beyond. So Tertullian embodies or sort of represents for us this one approach to classic Roman culture in the early Christian period. But there are others, as we've talked about. The next example that we can look at is it comes from Irenaeus. Irenaeus represents for us quite a different approach. And Irenaeus writes, for this reason too, magistrates themselves, having laws as clothing of righteousness whenever they act in a just and legitimate manner. So whenever they act in a just and legitimate manner, the leaders of a country or of a place shall not be called in question for their conduct, nor be liable to punishment. But whatsoever they do to the subversion of justice, whenever they act illegally, tyrannically, in these things shall they also perish, or they'll in doing these things they'll be judged. For the just judgment of God comes equally upon all. In no case is defective. So here, he says, earthly rule, therefore, has been appointed by God for the benefit of the nations and not by the devil. Notice the difference between what Irenaeus here is arguing or saying in his prescription against heresies and what Tertullian said in his approach. If Tertullian is at one end of the spectrum where he's saying, advocating for an entire rejection of sort of classic culture, of Greek culture that's influenced Roman society, Irenaeus is saying that earthly rule, that including Roman culture and all of these things, can be understood as appointed by God for the benefit of the nations, and not by the devil, to the degree that it is just and legitimate, that it is not subverting justice, that it is not illegal, that is not tyrannical. This is quite a different approach. And in fact, this word appointed by God or ordained by God is quite a different, I mean, it's quite a strong word to claim that earthly rule, those rulers and authorities are not appointed by the devil, but that they've been appointed by God for the benefit of society. And to the degree that they are just, that they conduct themselves in a just manner, then they should be obeyed, that they have been ordained by God to this position. In advocating for this, it's quite interesting, I think, the distinct difference. And then there are other examples. We have examples such as Justin Martyr, who finds sort of an in-between between these two poles, between these two sort of opposite positions, very distinct and different positions between Tertullian and Irenaeus. Between these two, if we consider these on a spectrum, then we might find we could recognize a number of positions between. Justin Martyr would be one sort of in between those. And so maybe to sum these up, because we've talked about these before, we might recognize at least three approaches. In Tertullian, basically, he asks the question, and his Christians like him in this early church period would ask this question: shall we carry a flag? Akidla, of course not. Carrying any flag, representing any political body, advocating for any political approach except for that of Christ, is a rival to Christ. This would be Tertullian's approach. So Christ over and against culture, over and against any sort of other political leadership, or sort of concession to going along with admitting any sort of compatibility between the two. Justin Martyr may be somewhere in between. He represents this in-between approach. As a Christian, I'm still a philosopher, so I do Christian philosophy. So he would advocate for trying to find a way to sort of contextualize, if you will, Christian ideas and thinking into the forms and the behavior, the ways of making sense of life in society. And then Irenaeus and Origen also represents this, the third approach. God ordains the rise of the Roman Empire to facilitate the spread of Christianity throughout the world. This is actually a quote from Origen. Origen and Irenaeus would be quite in line with each other on this idea. So these represent for us sort of three answers to the question of whether Christians ought to engage in political life and how they might do that, or what does that engagement or participation look like in the period before Constantine, in the period before Christianity comes into political power. When we come to the Edict of Milan and Constantine, there's a radical shift in faith and politics in the early church, a fundamental shift in how the church's role in society is understood. And this is not the only change. It's not the only event that sort of characterizes this. But for us, I think it's a helpful, what we call a watershed event or a threshold event that changes from sort of one particular period of time and particular relationships and helps us understand and interpret the very significant changes that follow, the very significant difference in behaviors and beliefs that follow that period of time. And so the significance that I'm arguing for, that I'm saying, we'll look at quite at the end of the session, but it's helpful for us to trace the history. What happened that led to the Edict of Milan? What happened that led to these really significant changes from the Edict of Milan forward for this 60, 70-year period that demonstrates this fundamental shift in the relationship of the church with society. To answer that question, we'll look at the period just before Constantine comes to power. And before Constantine comes to power, you have sort of the tail end of the Roman Empire that is represented in a plurality of leadership. During this period, you have these two figures, Maximian Augustus, who's the head, the highest power, and Diocletian Augustus of the East. So Maximian is the Augustus of the West, Diocletian is the Augustus of the East. And between these two, they are sort of the emperors, the leadership of the Roman Empire of the East and the West. And to put it in that way sounds like, it might be understood as sort of good friends, good buddies. Hopefully they trusted each other, but really there's a lot of rivalry and tension and concern about who's going to take more power. And not just each of these, but these are just very large land areas, very large geographies that are being ruled over by Maximian and by Diocletian. And so both Maximian and Diocletian also had appointed a Caesar or Caesar. The Caesar, the sort of vice regent, the one who worked under Maximian Augustus of the West, was Constantius Caesar, also known as Licinius. And Diocletian, the Augustus of the East, under him was Galerius Caesar of the East. And you can see in this map sort of the division, the ways of geography, where each was sort of ruling over, was assigned to administer these different regions. And with all of this different leadership in different regions, each of these leaders would have felt tremendous pressure to consolidate his rule. There are attempts at taking them down from within each of those geographies. Different generals in the army would have gathered around them support, and their armies would be loyal to them. And so this question of loyalty is really important. It shapes relationships of groups of people to these different leaders within the Roman Empire at this time. And particularly Galerius perceives that Christians, we can pick up little pieces of this tension in examples like Galerius persecuting Christians quite heavily in the region where that light pink region, where he was ruler. Galerius perceived that Christians were disloyal to him and persecuted them heavily. You also remember Diocletian perceived Christians as being disloyal, and there became more of a systematic persecution of Christians in this eastern region. And in the West, quite interestingly, Constantius, his son, Constantine, was a general in these armies, and Galerius suspected Constantine trying to gain the loyalty and respect of certain troops and would keep him under his authority or keep him under his rule in his court. There's a whole lot of intrigue. It's fascinating if you want to go and read some of this history and the intrigue, political intrigue between these parties. Kind of the summary of it is that Constantine, the son of Constantius Caesar of the west, of that yellow area, was able to escape from the sort of the courtroom of Galerius, goes back and assembles his troops, those who are loyal to him in the far west, in Britain, in this region that's highlighted in yellow. And Constantine builds this army around him. One of the things that he began to realize in gathering these troops is that there were a number of Christians living in this region, and they were, by allowing them to worship, by granting them sort of allowing and permitting them to worship as they wanted to, he was able to gain their loyalty. And so in attempting to gain the loyalty of all different groups of people, in order to build himself an army that was strong and that was loyal to him, he permitted a lot of groups, including and especially including Christians in his region, to worship as they wished, to do as they wished, without persecution. And this is key because Constantine developed a strong army underneath him who was loyal to him, and he marched on Rome. His march on Rome was an attempt to take over the Roman Empire, these various regions, and to make all of it subsumed, or to come under his authority and his power. So Constantine marches on Rome, and this famous battle at Milvian, outside the gates of Rome in 311, the Christian historian Eusebius tells the story that Constantine has a dream on the night before of the battle. The night before the battle, Constantine has this dream, and in the dream, he hears this voice that says in Latin, "Hoc signo vinces." I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that correctly. The words meaning, in this sign, it's understood, in this sign you shall conquer. And the sign that Constantine claims to have seen, or that Eusebius claims that Constantine had seen in his dream in the heavens, was the sign directly behind my picture here. This X, or chi, and rho, the Greek letters chi, rho, Christus Rex, Christ the King. Christus Rex was a Christian symbol, a known Christian symbol. Christus Rex, Christ is King. And Constantine saw this sign and woke up the next morning, saw this as a good omen, a good sort of indicator that they could win the battle, and had this sign erected on sort of flags, and went into battle with Christus Rex on his battle standards, on the battle flags, that they entered Rome and conquered Rome under this sign, under the sign of Christus Rex, Christ is King. Eusebius looks at this particular event and claims that this was sort of the beginning of this turn. And Constantine, because of the success in battle, fighting under the sign of Christ is King, continued fighting under this banner, and with Christians rallying around and with Constantine, Christian groups finding this freedom to be able to practice Christian worship, to hold Christian beliefs in the way that they wished, and not be persecuted, were happy to join or give loyalty to Constantine. So you can imagine, if Constantine is moving and gaining territory further and further into the Roman Western Empire, moving into the Eastern Empire, and continuing to conquer, and he's offering freedom from persecution. under the leader of that area, saying, be loyal to me and you won't be persecuted. Christians who are being persecuted would be happy, I would certainly be happy, to not be persecuted anymore, to be free to practice my faith and beliefs in a way that I wanted without having to pledge loyalty to and burn incense to this other leader who would be persecuting me. And so in this way, Constantine was able to gain the loyalty of Christians, particularly in regions under the other Caesars or Augustus of those regions, and gained power quite quickly and was quite successful. His army was quite strong. He conquered a significant amount of territory quite quickly. And by 313, so this is 2 years after conquering Rome, he signed the Edict of Milan with Galerius, who later he conquered anyway. But he signed the Edict of Milan in 313 that said, that states in this edict, when you see that this has been granted to Christians by us, your worship, or Lactantius, this historian is writing on this particular event. He writes, when you see that this has been granted to us, granted to Christians by us, your worship will know that we have also conceded to other religions the right of open and free observance of their worship for the sake of the peace of our times, that each one may have the free opportunity to worship as he pleases. This regulation is made that we may not seem to detract from any dignity of any religion. So the Edict of Milan becomes an edict, a rule under Constantine's empire, the areas, the parts of the empire that Constantine rules, that allows the open and free observance of worship. Anyone can worship whichever religion, follow whichever religion that they have chosen, and have this freedom. This, of course, gains the loyalty of all different groups under Constantine. Everyone is happy for this. But it also and leads to this expansion. Constantine is able to expand his leadership, his rule through the sword, but then offering peace for areas that he's conquered, and essentially unites the Roman Empire under his rule. And this changes the nature of the Roman Empire into a singular empire. This is a new period for the Roman Empire, being under the emperorship of a single emperor. No longer is the Senate really functioning at this point. No longer is sort of this democratic ideas or the values of sort of democratic rule really working. Constantine is the emperor, and he leads, and he conquers this whole area, moves the center in order to sort of destabilize the old centers of power and to reestablish them under his authority. He moves the center of the empire from Rome being the sort of the capital of the Roman Empire. He moves this capital to Constantinople, to Istanbul, which becomes, I forget what it's called at that time, Byzantium, but it becomes named Constantinople. He names it after himself. And this becomes the new center of the empire. And all of the sort of Roman signs, the Roman architecture, all of these things he brings in and rebuilds it, and much to the dismay of the old power, the old leadership, the old kind, like not head leader, but all of the people who would have had political power and influence in Rome suddenly find the rug pulled out from under them. The location of power has now shifted. The criteria for being in leadership has shifted. It's in a new location. And in this kind of environment, everyone who is politically minded, who wants to grab some of that power that they had previously, would ask themselves this question, well, how do I get close to the emperor? How do I get close to power? And since Constantine was claiming, seems to have claimed some form of Christianity, at least in name, although he hadn't been baptized until the end of his life. But because Christianity had sort of this favor, you find um, numbers of people, scores of people, politically, particularly people in political power who had political kinds of powerful roles in Rome, converting to Christianity in order to gain power. It was to their advantage to belong to the same religion of the ruler of the empire they perceived as being Christian. So these are some of the dynamics now that are shaping this new version of the Roman Empire. And this brings us really to our question. The question that this raises for us is what happens when those who are called servants of a carpenter, who call themselves servants of a carpenter, um, suddenly find themselves in the middle of imperial pomp and power, of all of the glory of the empire. What happens when a persecuted minority gains political standing and authority? And I would be quite interested to have some discussion around this question as we kind of contemplate the situation of the early church in this new political dynamic. What happens when a persecuted minority gains political standing and authority? What's at stake when that happens? We can think about this in a number of different ways, politically, socially. We can think about it in terms of theology, in terms of beliefs and practices, particularly related to the church. And so I think it would be quite interesting to continue this discussion either in WhatsApp or in our chat for this course. I have a few responses that I've prepared, some significant changes that are particularly related to theology. But I would be curious to hear what you think. When you get to this part of the video, maybe post your own thoughts. Pause the video here and kind of write out or think about what you think would happen. What happens from your experience and from your knowledge of history when a persecuted minority gains political standing and power? How does that influence and shape that group? How does it form them, this political power? How does it form them in new ways? Then when you've written that, unpause and we'll continue the discussion. So theologically, I'm really curious about what it means for Christianity to be in power. And the impact of Christianity coming into power is what now we look at, what there is now to look at. Because for us, Christians sitting in the 21st century, we only know a Christianity in power. Maybe we have come from traditions where Christianity has been in a minority, but Christianity has come to those regions or has known power. And so all of us have been influenced by Christian theology, by Christian thinking that has experienced being in power. None of us can draw on a tradition that has not been influenced by being in power at some point, where in the early church, this had not happened yet. But with this transition or this arriving into power, it shaped inevitably, it formed Christian theology and that formation has continued to influence Christian theology ever since. Thankfully, there's been critiques of that power all through history. There's been responses to it, and we'll continue to kind of look at those as we go forward in this study. But it is inseparable at this point, the influence of Christian theology that's been affected by, I don't want to say infected, but affected by the relationship to power. Um, there's a couple on this slide. You can see just a couple of sort of artifacts, historical artifacts that indicate this rise into power. The over on this symbol or this sign here on the left side of the screen, you see the Emperor Honorius holding a variant of a labrum. This is the battle flag. The Latin phrase on it is "In the name of Christ, be ever victorious." So this emperor carrying this battle flag, it says, "In the name of Christ, be ever victorious." The coin itself, a coin of Constantine from around 337, showing a depiction of this same labarum, this same sort of battle flag, spearing a serpent with the letters that would represent Christ in it. And of course, the picture from the Battle of Milvian, when Constantine conquers Rome. When we think about this, the huge social, political, theological shifts that resulted from this new situation, number one, persecution ceases. The persecution of Christians that we studied and understood from the first and second centuries, that develops even more in the third century to really systematic empire level persecution of Christians, ends. And this is a good thing for Christians to not be killed. This is good. It has impact. It changes and affects the theology, the thinking of Christians, the beliefs and practices of Christians. But it is a good thing for people to not be killed and to not be persecuted for their faith. So not all changes are negative. Another change, though, that we can observe is that for many, riches and prosperity came to be seen as signs of divine favor. Previously, if you were persecuted, you remember from the testimony of Perpetua, of Felicity, of other martyrs that we read, they could look at the disfavor that they were experiencing in society, the persecution and the oppression that they were experiencing as being indicators of their faithfulness, of being that they've been found worthy to follow in Christ's footsteps. But in this new setting, riches and prosperity of having access to politics and power, of provisions and of prosperity, these become signs of divine favor, because God has granted favor to the emperor. God has granted favor to win battles militarily, but also politically and economically. All of these are interwoven. So riches and prosperity come to be seen as signs of divine favor. Maybe not so good. Certainly, riches and prosperity are not evil in and of themselves, but when they become signs, indicators that people look for, wow, this person is rich, this person is prosperous in society, God must be with them. This can be problematic. Official theology develops. This is another development that we'll be studying and looking at more. Official theology develops both in terms of doctrine and of worship. The doctrinal side of this is also represented in the fourth point here: Christian schismatics, where there's theological diversity around issues. This theological diversity that perhaps is tolerated or just as a part of discourse between different groups in the early church period now becomes threatening to the fabric of the empire. If you have a theological division, then this also becomes a political issue. The peace of the empire is threatened, or can become threatened, if the empire is considered Christian and there's divisions between people over beliefs, over Christian ideas or theology. But also, so doctrinally or theologically, unity becomes a political issue. Having the same beliefs becomes a political issue. And then also in worship, you see, and we've talked about this, I think, in class previously, where the symbols and practices of worship in the empire become adopted and adapted into the church practices, the liturgy of marching into church, a cathedral or a church building, the procession that sort of takes on these military and political practices or shapes or directions. All of this sort of official worship and official doctrine, these are all shaped by this new reality, this new situation. There's also kind of this fifth point here, the idea of coming kingdom, where in the eschatology of the early church always looked to Christ's coming as something in the future that had not happened yet. And they're yearning for this future kingdom where things would be made right, because they recognized all around them that the persecution that was being experienced, the brokenness that they experienced around them, was not Christ's ultimate rule. But in the idea of the coming kingdom ends up being exchanged for the fulfillment of the kingdom in the present. So the idea, eschatologically speaking, in the period post-Constantine, the fulfillment of the kingdom in the present is more and more experienced and then talked about by Christians. The sense of prosperity, of riches, of unity, of all things being fulfilled leads to perhaps settling, whatever we want to call it, this idea that the kingdom, Christ's rule and reign, is fulfilled in the present, in the now. And this then comes to shape other theological ideas about church leadership, about all kinds of theological ideas that are influenced and affected by this belief that the kingdom, Christ's kingdom, is being fulfilled now in the present, in the church, in the rule of the church, in society, and in the rule of the church, right up to the kind of very top levels of political power in the empire. So we can observe these sorts of shifts, and we'll continue to examine them more closely when we come to look at theologians in the post-Constantine period. Augustine, when we look at the debates of the related to Christ's divinity and humanity in Nicaea, in Chalcedon, even the gathering of the church in these official church councils where everyone comes together to try to come to an agreement about official doctrine. These all represent innovations, new things that have come about because of this new situation in the church being in power. So with that, we'll end this session on political theologies in the early church and this transition that brings us into the period of the imperial church, the church in power. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, both in the WhatsApp group. We'll have some more chat about this in future sessions live as well on Zoom. So please share your thoughts and your ideas, questions, comments, things that sort of stand out to you. What stands out to you from this transitional period, this threshold period of the church moving into power? All right, we'll see you all soon.